Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. This event has been in the planning for some time. The week of the Nakba. Let's go back and talk to a couple of really distinguished Palestinians as they recall what happened in 1948. We didn't really expect to be where we are now, with a vicious attack on Jerusalem, on people praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, the holy month, and especially on Laylatul Qadr, the most important evening of the year. The prayers, there was the most brutal attack on people there. But also we saw the continuing Nakba over the last couple of weeks with the threat to evict Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. So not only are we now looking back at what happened in 1948, we're also reflecting and hearing news as we speak of atrocities by the Israelis against the Palestinians, which continue 73 years on. The PSC has organized a protest tomorrow with our partners in London at 6 o'clock. And I know that branches up and down the country have been organizing and will be organizing other events. Please go and show your support for the Palestinian people by attending one of these events. And clearly we'll continue to monitor what happens and look at our plans for Saturday and find the most appropriate way of responding to how events unfold. But I was really looking forward to speaking, and I am looking forward to speaking to our distinguished Palestinians tonight. It isn't going to be a happy occasion because although we're talking about their youth, it was a very difficult upbringing for our two speakers. I was born after that, but my memory is of 1967, when I remember my mother crying in 1967. I was only 5 years old at the time in Saudi Arabia. And I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Your grandmother has been occupied," or words to that effect. And that brought the connection with Palestine at an early age. And then I saw her preparing Palestinian flags, sewing Palestinian flags with other Palestinian women and collecting donations for Palestine. So mine is a different connection. But for our two speakers, the connection was different. It was in 1948 and what happened as they experienced that. Our two distinguished Palestinians are Dr. Ghada Karmi, who lives in the UK. You know her as one of our patrons, one of the PSC patrons, but also a distinguished writer and advocate for Palestinian rights. And we also welcome Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, who is also joining us tonight, who again, I'm proud to say, is one of the PSC patrons, but also has done absolutely tremendous work in documenting the issues around the refugees and the destroyed villages, and has prepared some wonderful atlases as well. So we're going to go back to that starting point, and then I'll have a series of questions which I will ask each of our distinguished speakers, and I'll start with a question to Ghada, if I may, Ghada. Good evening, and first of all, welcome to the event, and thank you very much indeed for taking part. And really, what I'd like to start off with is to ask about family life in Palestine in 1948, as you recall it. So that's really, what do you remember?
Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be able to talk about this to all of you, and it's very good that PSC has put this on, and I'm very appreciative of that. Having said that, my memory is poor. My memory of 1948 is quite poor. Really, I think, I've often thought about this. Why do I not remember very much? And I think the reason is that it was so traumatic. Obviously at the time, I was living a child's life in a a reasonable family environment. My mother was a very typical Palestinian woman of her time and class. She loved people. Our home was often the place where her lady friends got together in something called an istiqbal. That's a very, very important occasion for women. Istiqbal was where they invited their women friends, usually during the day when the men were out of the way. And they usually made the most delicious foods. We loved these istiqbals because it meant we could have some of this. Anyway, she, you know, that's how it was. And for me as a child, everything seemed okay. My father went to work. We look forward to him coming back. My mother was, as I say, typical of her time. Now we had, in my case, we had a village woman called Fatima, and a fallaha in Arabic, who would come every day to help my mother with the house, but she also helped with the children and very much myself. And she meant a lot to me. Anyway, she was, it was as a normal family life. We were an ordinary family, which is why what happened to us was so shattering, was so unexpected, was so unfair. So insofar as that goes, those are my memories.
Could you just remind us where you were born and grew up in Palestine, just in case people aren't aware?
Yes, of course I should have said that. I was born in Jerusalem, and that's where I lived until we had to leave in 1948. Which is why, by the way, the events that are happening in Sheikh Jarrah and at the Al-Aqsa compound and mosque are so painful for me, really, because what memories I have are of Jerusalem. Now, we lived at the west, on the west side of Jerusalem, which was the newer side, where Jewish immigrants lived too. But of course, at that time, we didn't know the danger we were in. Certainly, I mean, my mother wouldn't have had any idea. So, you know, people helped them and were nice to them and, you know, were friendly. So really to see how, from such beginnings, this nightmare has unfolded for Palestinians through no fault of their own, is really appalling. Now, my family, in fact, originates in the West Bank town of Tul Kern. But by the time I was born, and my sister, my brother, we were all out of Tul Kern. And as I say, we were in Jerusalem.
So that's where the Karmi comes from, presumably. It is the reference to Tul Kern.
Absolutely. So Karmi is from Tul Kern.
Yeah.
The family from Tul Kern. Yes, that's right. It's a standing joke that my father always used to say, we were the only family called Karmi until there were suddenly people popping up all over the place called Karmi. And my father would say, who are these people? They're imposters. They've taken on this. Anyway.
Thank you for that. And I mean, while we talk about the memories of then, soon we'll see the Al Jazeera film, which is Palestine 1920. It has come out in the Arabic version, and it showed what a vibrant, economically viable, very well structured economy Palestine had at the time. So I saw the Arabic version, and apparently the English version is coming out soon. Dr. Salman, welcome. And I really want to take you back to the time before 1948 as well, and where you were born, grew up, and what your memories of Palestine then are.
Thank you, Kamel. I was born in Palestine, proper Palestine, which we knew for at least 2,000 years. I was born in a place called Al-Ma'in, which means the spring. It is in southern part of Palestine. It's only 8 kilometers away from the Mediterranean, east of Khan Yunis. Our land, our family land is about 15,000 acres. And we grew wheat, fruits. We had cattle, we have horses. We fed ourselves and actually exported wheat. My time of birth was during a violent time in Palestine. It was the latter part of the 1930, when the Arab revolt of 1936 to 39 was boiling, when people discovered, to their great dismay, that Britain betrayed the promises and allowed hordes of Jewish settlers from ghettos of Eastern Europe to come unchecked to our land, to the extent they became about 30% of the population. So my family fought very hard in the revolt of 1936. In fact, my family was one of the leaders of the revolt in Beersheba district and Gaza, and they kicked the British out of Palestine from November 1938 to November 39, in which southern Palestine became completely free of British presence, completely. And they set up a national rule and so on. Then the British came back again after that. One of the things I remember also in the early 1940s, Australian soldiers were brought from Australia to Palestine to defend it, because Rommel army was approaching Egypt from the west, and the British were afraid that the Germans will take over Egypt, then they will continue to Palestine. They had no forces, so they brought forces from Australia to defend Palestine. I remember those soldiers with their funny habits, because of course, the Australians were there in Palestine in the same spot in 1917. Now, one of the things which I now remember, at the time I didn't realize it, that I did not see a Jew in my life until 1948. I never know how they looked like. Some people who came back from Jaffa, they say they speak different dialects, different languages. They don't look the same. Some wear British Army uniforms, some not. And I say, who are these people? Why are they coming here? And that was a shocking experience for me to realize what they were there for in 1948. But my family is deeply rooted in Al Ma'in. We have written records of my great grandfather and the Ottoman archives when they were ruling or in control of our area, which was under their control. So we were independent, we were masters of our land, we lived happily, and we cultivated our land, and we were, by the way, as I just said, present in all Palestinian national movements. My father, for example, met Churchill in 1921 when he came to Palestine, because Herbert Samuel, the Zionist High Commissioner of Palestine, complained that Palestinians are revolting against British rule and Zionist immigration. So he met my father and two others of the area, and I asked my father, what did you ask him for? What did you ask Churchill? He said, we didn't ask him. He asked us. I said, what did he ask you for? He said, he asked us for peace and quiet, and we don't revolt against the British, and that Palestinian rights will all be respected. And he assured us that Britain will never violate the obligations to Palestinians. And in fact, that was written in a document which is now in the British archives. He also told us, we respect your property rights and your ways of life, and the only thing we ask you not to revolt against the British. So he asked us not to revolt against the British, not the other way around. So that was the situation. on the eve of a Nakba.
Thank you very much indeed. That's really an important interjection into, the links that your family had. And of course, 8 kilometers away from the Mediterranean means almost walking distance to the edge of Gaza now, as it is.
Absolutely.
I always say that Palestinians can walk home if only they're allowed to from Gaza, where 80% of the Palestinians are refugees. So that is the starkest thing that we can present to people. People are not trying to infiltrate; they want to go home, and that is so important. If I can move the conversation now onto 1948 itself, I know, Ghada, I don't know if you can sort of. I know you talked about your memory, but I'm sure you've experienced it and you also discussed it with relatives and so on. So now moving on to the events of 1948 and what you experienced, if you can sort of recall some of these.
Yes, look, it occurs to me that people should know that I have written about all this in my memoir, In Search of Fatima.
Okay.
Perhaps we could have the cover of this book.
I will make sure it comes up in while you talk to us about your experiences.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I think honestly, one thing I can do is to read you a short paragraph from In Search of Fatima, which is about that particular period in which I have said, when I look back, I see how that time in my life is overlaid with areas of silence, impenetrable to memory. I was aware that everything had gone wrong with us, but did not know why, or whether my world would ever come back again. The sunny times, the friends, the going to and coming from school. Around me, events succeeded each other with a relentless momentum, heading for some cataclysm. And we were being pushed uncontrollably by this momentum, powerless to stop it. And that, is really how it felt. For me as a child, I didn't understand what on earth was going on. But those early months of 1948, with which I described in that extract, really became a succession of horrors, of fear, of things which were incomprehensible to me. So, for example, at the beginning in January 1948, there was a very big hotel called Semiramis, quite an important hotel, behind our house, about 2 roads up. Now, this hotel was one where lots of foreign journalists congregated, where many visiting Arabs were present. It was quite a landmark. Well, on one night in January, and I've described this, there was crashing and thunder and lightning. I thought that's what it was. I thought it was a storm. In fact, it was bombs which had exploded in the building and brought it right down. Early hours of the morning, and the next day, rubble in place of the hotel, bodies being taken out. Now, young as I was, I realized this is absolutely terrible. And thereafter, in those months leading up to April 1948, every few days there was something, and it got worse and worse and more frequent. For example, things that a child would notice, the village women who used to come to our house, they'd come from the villages with their vegetables, fruits to sell at the door. They stopped coming. So obviously there was something very wrong. And one of the things that I recall, there were snipers. Snipers had taken hold of empty buildings. The reason those buildings were empty is people were already leaving out of fear, out of a desire to protect their families. And so the snipers, they're Jewish snipers, took hold of these buildings and they would shoot at people walking along the street. It was terror, just a reign of terror. Anyway, one morning, a Bedouin man was coming down with his baskets, because he, like the village would go around the houses and sell cheese and yogurt and that kind of thing. That's all he was doing. He was shot and he crumpled near our house. And what I remember is that he sort of collapsed like a stack of cards, and it looked like a game. I couldn't understand that, so of course he'd been shot dead. Now, that kind of thing happened with greater frequency. The neighbors started leaving one by one until it was virtually, the street was empty. And, you know, my mother would say, I'm not leaving. I am not leaving. This is my house. I'm not leaving. No Jew is ever going to push me out of here. And she maintained this stand until early April 1948. People may know that on the 8th of April, 8th and 9th, two very important events happened. One was the massacre at Derria, where over 100 men, women, children were killed by Zionist gangs who turned up in this peaceable village, which had made a pact with the Zionists that they would not be aggressed in return for them not interfering and so on. It didn't help them. They were shot and they were killed, and the victorious trucks of these Jewish terrorists went all through the streets of Jerusalem with their loudspeakers saying, well, you saw what happened at Derria, you're next. It had quite an effect. It really was very powerful. It worked. People were terrified and they started to leave. Anyway, the next day, a very important nationalist Palestinian leader, Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, who was brave and plucky and had tremendous charisma and was capable of attracting so many fighters to the cause, was killed by the Zionists, and shattering blow that was demoralized a lot of the Palestinian fighters, but the effect on us was just as bad. My father made a decision that we could no longer stay. It was too unsafe. And but you must understand, no Palestinian thought that when they were leaving like that they were never coming back. They thought we must evacuate our families, put them somewhere safe for a while, and then of course we'd all be back. And that's what happened. My mother packed a case for all 5 of us, and ridiculous, but just a change of underwear, things like that, because she had no possibility of imagining that we would never return. So we got all pushed into a taxi, a very rickety taxi, which was terrified of our neighborhood because our neighborhood was notorious by then. The neighborhood was called Katamon. It was one of the nice new suburbs of Jerusalem, a mixed neighborhood with Christians and, as I said, with Jews. And people were scared to go there because they knew it was very dangerous. Nevertheless, we managed to get this taxi, and we somehow got pushed into it. And I tell you, this moment for me in my life, I think just sums up the whole tragedy. I didn't know why we were leaving. Now, you must understand again that in those days, there was no knowledge of psychology. Nobody thought these children have to be told so they're not scared. We were just bundled along, and we just went with our parents. I didn't know why we were leaving, but I knew this, that we were leaving something very precious to me. My home, the only home I'd ever known. My village lady whom I loved, Fatima, and we had a dog. He was a mongrel, but we loved him dearly. He was called Rex, and we had to leave him behind, and that had the most awful effect on me. And so you know, as I say, we were of that.
Yeah, yeah. And where did you head to? So that day?
Right. So we went to Damascus.
Oh,
And yeah.
so we'll pick that up a little later.
Sure.
I'll just want to go down south, if you like, to Salman, to see what happened while all of this was going on in Jerusalem, in his neighborhood, so to speak. Dr. Salman.
Could you say the question again, please?
Yes, so if you could now describe what we heard from Ghada was what happened to her in Jerusalem, and around the same time, things must have been happening in your area. So what happened as we came up to 1948, and when did you leave, and so on?
Yes, yes. This is, of course, very clear in my mind. I finished primary education 4 years in the school which my father built in our land in 1920. When I finished that, he sent me over to Beersheba boarding school to have more education. In April 1948, the schoolmaster gathered us. We were children in the age of from 8 to 12. I was 10 at the time, and said to us, the Jews had killed our people in Derria. I cannot protect you in the boarding school now. You better go home to your families. So we collected our things, myself and one other child my age, and I found also a older person from my family, and we have to walk back home 45 kilometers from Beersheba to Al-Ma'in. And we had to walk. We were warned that the Haganah jeeps are driving along and shooting everybody they could find. So the older boy told us, if you see the Jews, just lie down in the field and pretend, don't show yourself. So I arrived to my home after a day and a half of walking, of course, very tired. I did not know that this date was a crucial date in the history of the Haganah, because it was the opening salvo of Operation Dalet, in which the Haganah started to depopulate 220 villages in the coast of Palestine, making up half of all the refugees, while the British were watching and doing nothing at all, and before any Arab soldier came to rescue us from Derria. Later, of course, I knew that Derria was not the only massacre. There were about 50 massacres in that period. So when I arrived home in April, I thought that was the end of it. But I didn't know that after 6 weeks on that date, to be precise, on the 14th of May, 1948, the Haganah attacked us with 20 armored vehicles. At night, an old woman woke up and saw 20 lights, or 40 lights actually, of 20 vehicles peering at us in the middle of the night. She screamed, the Jews are coming, the Jews are coming. So we children and women ran to a ravine, hid there. And the young men, not many, about a dozen or two, fought back with old rifles. They stopped the Jews from advancing for the good part of the night and the morning. But in the morning when we woke up, we never slept, of course, when the sun shines, we saw they blew up the house or the school which my father built in 1920. They burnt and destroyed all our houses. They actually bombed and blew up the water mill and flour mill which we built, and the sky was full of smoke billowing in the sky. It was a sign of extreme devastation. Later on, I knew that one day earlier, our school teacher was a young man from Borer village. And one day earlier, on 30th of May, they attacked his village and committed a big massacre in his village, killing 125 people. And they torched the village completely. It was set ablaze because of farmers' houses have a lot of hay. And actually they threw grenade in every house, killing the families which are huddled in the house. So for me, when I saw the devastation in the morning, it was a scene I never forgot. Now, my father said to my other brothers, take your brother with you to Cairo to finish his education. Why is that? Because my father was pioneer in education. By this time, he had 4 sons educated at Cairo universities in medicine, engineering, and law. So he said, go join your brothers. I was in primary school and they were at the university, but I have no other way. So I left my home, Al Ma'in, on the 25th of May 1948, and I was not allowed to come back since that time. But of course, it remained in my mind and soul, and I spent all my life later on to document it. And
so you went to Cairo. What happened to the family, to your father and I don't know if your mother was?
They all became refugees in Gaza Strip, just 2 kilometers away. And every night they look over the lights and see the settlers in our home. We are today 8,500 people, refugees in Gaza Strip. Our land, as I said, 15,000 acres. It is occupied by 4 kibbutz. One of them is called Nerim. Nerim is right on my father's land. They were allotted 32,000 dunams, which is almost half of our land. And the kibbutz members, Nerim, in our land, has membership of 175 members. 175 members have stolen the land of 9,000 people till today. The irony is, which I'm going to allude to later, there is a woman from Bronx in New York. She came a settler on my land, and she had a blog in the Times of Israel. Every day she complains, I'm afraid. I lock my room because the terrorists in Gaza are frightening me. And she did not say, of course, that F-15 and bombs and tanks and so on have been bombed refugee camps continuously for 73,000.
And as I always remind people.
And this brings me just to one point.
Yeah.
I still count the days I became refugees. They are today 26,658 days I am a refugee out of my home, which I can see within sight.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. And I mean, as I always say to people, a settlement that they hear about is Sedrot. And I always say to them, you know, this is the land of Najd. Najd is Sedrot, and they never say that, but people from Najd also live in Gaza, and they could walk back to Najd.
3 kilometers away.
3 kilometers away, even closer than maybe where you are. Yeah. Thank you very much. And so we'll pick up the story about your journey then to Cairo and what happened after that. But I'll go back to Ghada and you might just tell us a little bit about why Damascus and how, if you remember that journey, why Damascus, why you went to Damascus, and then really to talk about what happened to the family after 1948. And we keep it brief so that we can fit everything we want to get into the hour, if possible.
Okay, well, why Damascus was because my mother's family lived in Damascus. So my grandparents were there, and it was natural for my father to assume that the best thing to do was to go there, and his plan was that we would accompany us there, and then he would return back to his job, because there was absolutely no feeling at the time that he couldn't do that. So that's what happened. We drove, we were in a taxi, we arrived in Damascus. Now, I don't remember much about that journey because I was so, I suppose, very shocked. Fatima said goodbye to me, and I cried and I wept, and she kept waving, and I just sensed that this was somehow worse than it looked. Anyway, and so when we arrived in Damascus, I hated it. I'll tell you the truth. It wasn't my house. It was a very old quarter of Damascus, a poor quarter actually. And at the same time as we arrived, floods of refugees were arriving from northern Palestine, from Safad, from places like that. And what I can tell you is that the local people in that part of Damascus, and I presume all over, were extremely generous. They opened their homes, they opened the mosques, the schools were taken over in order to give the refugees some shelter. Because my grandfather was there, we joined him in his house, which was very old-fashioned. My aunt's family joined us very soon after. She used to live in the old city of Jerusalem with her husband and her family. We were crowded. And as I was saying, without understanding why the hell this was happening, I'm constantly tried to say, when I've answered the questions, Kamel, in a way that people will try to see this through the eyes of a child. How terrifying, how confusing, how shocking. And so there we were. We slept on the floor in a room where my brother and my sister also slept, and my uncle, and so on. So it was a very scary, unpleasant time. And what can I say? All I could think of was not so much, of course, because I had no awareness, as to why these people were flooding in. But all I knew was that this was a horrible place, apart from my grandfather's house. The rest of it, crowded, dirty. Jerusalem was clean and wonderful by comparison. And there was nobody for me. That is the thing, as a child. Who was there for me? Certainly nobody, not my mother, not my father. They were all overwhelmed. So it was.
Your father and mother went back, or just your father?
No, my mother wanted to go with him, but he wouldn't have it, and we wouldn't have it. We were terrified. No, he went on his own. Okay. But he didn't get far, because Katamon, very shortly after we left, fell to the Zionists. Okay. They had their eye on West Jerusalem because that's where a very strong number of Zionist colonies had already been established. And they coveted West Jerusalem and, of course, their eye on the rest of Jerusalem after that. And so he went back. He couldn't get in. He couldn't even get near our neighborhood. And he had to turn back. Okay. So
then the journey, was that the next step? Was that Britain then, eventually after that? Is that how things developed? Or
No, because another thing people need to understand is, remember, there's a flood of people, no work, no jobs, no money. So everybody was milling around trying to find jobs, including my father, who had taken out a small amount of money. All the rest of his money was in the Bank of Palestine, which the Zionists took over. So he didn't really, he was desperate for work. And after some months, an opportunity came up, which was at the BBC Arabic service, which had been established a few years before that date, was looking for bilingual staff. And they set up a whole interviewing thing in Cairo, and he went there, he was interviewed, they took him, they appointed him, and he went to London. And I tell you, it was a bitter conflict between me and my father. Sorry, between my mother and my father, because she is an Arab woman, brought up in the Arab world, traditional, conventional. She knew nothing about England, London, and why was my father doing this to us? She would say to him, stay, stay. Other people are getting jobs in Jordan, in Cairo. And he said, I've got to take what there is on offer. I can't support you. I can't support the family. And so that was it. He left us. We stayed on in Damascus, waiting until he got himself established. My mother hoping constantly we wouldn't have to go to this horrible place called London, called England, about which she knew nothing, but it was no good.
Okay, okay. And but so which year did you then arrive in England? Do you remember?
Yeah. Arrived in England in September 1949, having left Palestine in April 1948. And
we'll pick that up, you know, in terms of thinking about what happened next. I just want to go back to Dr. Salman, but I mean, from both conversations, education, which is so important to Palestinians today, again, featured so strongly in what Dr. Salman was saying, that, that his father had sent all his brothers to study, to learn, to become engineers, doctors. And that's been a real feature that sustained the Palestinians over the years. So, Dr. Salman, you went to Cairo. A little bit about what happened over the next few years and where you eventually settled.
Yes, let me pick up from the last sentence you made. My father naturally has been, by his own background education, very fond of education. But we all remember as Palestinians that education is the only asset Israel cannot steal from us. And this is true today, always. Now, on the 15th of May, when I became a refugee for the first time, I realized I'm a refugee. That was the same date when Ben Gurion declared his settler state in Tel Aviv. So I left my boarding school when Plan Dalet started, and I became a refugee when Ben Gurion declared his settler state. So the next morning when I viewed the landscape with the smoldering remains of my house and our property and so on, my father instructed my brother, who was studying in Cairo, and he came to see us, to take me with him to study. So we went to Cairo with my brother and also my cousin, who was also studying in Cairo in engineering. My cousin became one of the founders of PLO. Now, when we say we went to Cairo, that's just a short sentence with no meaning. In fact, we went to Khan Yunis, the nearest place. We found no trains. The trains have stopped. So we have to walk on the railway line until we reach the first Egyptian town, which is Rafah. And we took the train there. The train was full of people, mostly Egyptians returning to Egypt because of Palestine situation.
Yeah.
So nobody asked us anything, but in the way, on the train, an officer came, say, "What are your papers?" We had no papers. I obviously had no papers at all. And my brother and cousin did not have any papers. They said, "You should have papers. You must have a passport. We can't let you in." He said, "Well, everything was destroyed and burnt. We just came out barely alive. We have no papers whatsoever, no property whatsoever." He said, "Well, I cannot let you." So he took us prisoners. The officer took us prisoners to the nearest police station in Qantara to investigate our case. So we put us in a cell, and I was with them, and in Al-Qantara police station. At night, I heard a noise or someone singing strange language, He was singing, strange language. We asked the guard, who is this person? Who's singing here? He said, this is an Egyptian Jew. He is going back to Palestine. He's going back to Palestine. I said to myself, my God, this man who's singing, he must be going back to take my home. And he's going to fight us to take my home. And I cannot escape that vision from my mind. When they took us into a prisoner's train to Cairo to check whether my brother and his cousin are really students at Cairo University, the policeman put handcuffs in their hands, and he put handcuffs in mine. And innocently, I withdrew my hands from the handcuffs. So they are too small. So the soldier said to the officer, sir, I cannot handcuff him. And the officer said, hold him by hands, soldier, hold him by hand. So we arrived in Cairo in the middle of the night with about 200 convicted criminals taken to jails in Cairo. This train was for convicted criminals. And after a long story, anyway, we stayed in jail. Next day, my brother and his cousin went to Cairo University. They got papers and they were released. And they had to sign for me as a refugee. They are responsible for my food and education. Otherwise, I would have stayed in the prison. And of course, it went on. I finished my high school with the top marks in all of Egypt. And also in Cairo University, I had a degree in engineering. Then after a short spell in Kuwait, I went to England in 1960 to do my PhD at University College London.
Can I take you back to your parents and what happened? Because you went to Cairo, so what happened to them?
Who? My brother?
Your parents, yeah.
My parents became refugees, as I said, in Gaza.
Went to Gaza, yes.
Gaza until they died in 1970, right.
Okay.
So from England, I worked a little bit in England. Then I got professorship at a Canadian university until 1975. Then I went back to Kuwait. I started my engineering company. I did many projects in the Middle East and in Europe and Canada. And in 1990, I have to go back to Canada again after the invasion of Kuwait. Then I returned again after that.
And we'll pick up on the next stage, or the stage that was important, which is you return back to Palestine as we move the conversation on to that point. And then what you did in terms of how you reacted to all of this as a Palestinian.
Yes, but let me just tell you a little story.
Okay.
In England. It was a great experience for me to be in London. Of course, I hated Britain as a political institution because it is the cause of all what we have been through. But I made many good friends, my colleagues at the university, and they are friends until today. One anecdote which is worthwhile to tell, I went to renew my card. We were given something called alien's card. Alien's card.
I remember.
So I went to renew it. And I took my card and left the office, and I looked again at the section called nationality. It was written uncertain. I was uncertain. So I went back to the clerk and said, look, there's a mistake here. I'm Palestinian. Why do you write uncertain? And I looked at him. He was probably in his 40s. He could have been probably in Palestine government. So England, everybody, an official in England, knew what Palestine was. They may have said in it when they left in the disgraceful escape from Palestine, leaving it to the Zionists. So he said, looked at me, I'm sorry, son, I'm sorry. This is only formality. That was the shock of my life. Yeah. There was another shock immediately in the same year. I wanted to know about Palestine. Britain, of course, has been the mandatory power for 30 years. And I went to Royal Geographical Society, and I wanted to see maps of Palestine. And they said, no, we have no Palestine. I said, are you sure? I said, yes, we have no. I said, look, I'm sure there is. Show me a map. And looked at the map on the Middle East. And there was Palestine. I said, this is Palestine. He said, you mean Israel? And I found that he canceled all the names of files in the Royal Geographical Society and so on all other archives and called it Israel. And of course, from that time, I made a worldwide search for documents about Palestine.
And we'll pick that up as we come to the most recent of times. But I want to go back to Ghada and pick up on, at some point, the opportunity to go back home must have sort of arisen, Ghada. And so when, how, what happened? I know we have to be brief because of the time, and we could talk for hours about these issues, but we just got to try and get it in. So can you take us through when you decided, when you were able to return, and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that we'd come to England, as I was explaining, and I'd grown up in England and been educated and so on and so forth, and it became, to all intents and purposes, my country, actually. Now, throughout all those years, my parents didn't talk about Palestine. People need to understand that the image of the refugee who tells the little children, the grandchildren, and so on, about the villages they came from, etc., did not apply to us. And I think we were not unique. I think really that the trauma was so tremendous for my parents, they could never speak of it. So actually they cut out talk about Palestine, except in very political terms. My father would talk about politics, etc. But we didn't know, we didn't have, anyway. Part of that was that they didn't attempt to go back to visit. They didn't attempt to encourage us to do so. And so I was the first in the family to say in 1991, look how late this was, I thought, no, I can't go on like this. I had by then become a political activist, etc., a lot of awareness. And of course, I then realized that the way to think of it is that this is my homeland, currently occupied by people who shouldn't be there, but it's nonetheless my land. So because of that, I went, and I went all over. And I tell you, it was pretty painful. It was painful. I was not prepared for the anger and disgust I felt at these people walking about as if they owned the place and looking very happy, knowing that some of them, or a family amongst them, had taken over our house in Qatamon and lived there and made out it was their own. So then that was the first of several visits. But then when I went in 2005, I actually went and lived in Ramallah. And that was the subject of my sequel, the memoir called Return, and in which I've detailed a lot of these experiences.
And at what point did you go back to your house? Because that's really, I'm really interested in. So you went back in 1991, did you say? So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, so I tried to find the house. I couldn't because my sister, who was the eldest of us, she drew a map for me, and it just didn't work. I found a place which I thought was our house, but it really wasn't. And then I had another go. Finally, in a visit in 1998, that was the time I found the house. And there's a photograph of the front of the house. I found it, and it had living in it a Canadian Jewish family who were tenants. And I remember asking them, you know, who owns this? And they said that it was none of their business. They were obviously scared. But I realized it was some Israeli, and that obviously the house had been sold to various people. And eventually, I would just tell you that in 2005, which is when I was there, which is in the memoir, I was contacted by the bureau chief of the New York Times, amazingly enough, by email, who said to me, I have a feeling I'm living in your house. I've read your memoir, and I honestly think it's the house. And very nice communication. Would you like to come and see it? I'm aware that it's not easy for you Palestinians, but I'm very happy. Please do come, etc. So off I went, and indeed there he was. You know, I went around the house. There was he lived. Somebody had built a story above our house. Our house was a single story, and somebody had built at some point. One of the Zionists and the Israelis who'd taken it over had built an apartment which belonged to the New York Times. So that current bureau chief invited me to have a drink in this story above the house, and there's no doubt it was the house. And he then took me down and with a great camera and said, I'm very happy to take lots of photographs of you visiting your house. You know, that I know that's not easy or something. And he spoke to the family that lived there, was what I would call liberal Zionists, who were very apologetic and very anxious to make friends. It was a dreadful experience because I went, it wasn't our house. It really wasn't. It had the facade, it had the look, but it wasn't, of course.
And of course, you found the house, whereas I think in Dr. Salman's case, it was very different, that return journey. So Dr. Salman, what happened when you eventually, which year was it, and what happened when you went back to the village you came from, or to the town you came from?
Well, in October 1995, we all had the false, now to be confirmed as false, impression that Oslo would bring us back home. So I decided to visit my home, Palestine, all of it. And I took my daughter with me to show her Palestine. She heard me spoke of Palestine endless days and nights. So I said, now let me prove it to you that on the ground.
And so here's the proof. Here's the proof. I think we have the video.
Right.
I think if you give us a second, we'll get the video because it was the proof.
Yeah, but before you have that, we arrived at
okay, just hold on, James. Okay, yes, Dr. Salman, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, we went around from Jerusalem north to Safat, Tabariya, and then Akka, and then Haifa, where my wife, her mother, was born in, and then went to Jaffa, and then down south to Al-Majdal, till I found, before you show the video, let me just say this. I have a taxi driver from Jerusalem who spoke Hebrew. He's Palestinian. And I used to tell him, now in 2 kilometers, turn left. After that, there is a roundabout, go left. And then I say, stop there and look to the left and right and so on. He said, you must have been before. I said, it's not like that. I have never left. I have never left. So I was amazed that I knew every corner of Palestine while we were driving. Then we arrived at my home place, birthplace, and I wanted to show Rania my place. So finally, we arrived at the spot where I was born and where also my father built the school. She recorded that. This is the video.
يا بلادي يا بلادي يا وطني يا وطني يا وطني هذا وطني هنا ولدت هنا ولدت هلا بوريكم وين ولدت هون 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 وراء الشجرات المدرسة اللي تعلمت فيها هون. يا بلادي عدت إليك بعد 47 عاما يا بلادي. أرضي اللي انولدت عليها هنا، هاي مدرستي هنا. نسفوها كلها مدرستي، نسفوها، ولكن لم ينزعوا حب بلادي من قلبي. هذه بلادي. هؤلاء الذين قتلوا لكي يجعلوني لاجئ وشريد. وانت يا رانيا اول جيل بعد 12 جيل لم يولد هنا، والا كانت الارض هذه كلها ارضك. وها انت تعودين اليها. يا الهي يا الهي، تعالوا تعالوا.
The pain, I mean, obviously, whether it was not finding the place, but knowing where it is, or whether, as with Ghada, actually finding the house itself, the pain is no less that you found the house or you found the piece of land. I know when I go and I go back to places, I remember after 1967, when I went, that the memories even now come flooding back in my youth, and that's exactly what happened in both your cases. What I want to do is to move the conversation on to what you both went on to do. First of all, you didn't forget Palestine, neither of you. I haven't, even though I haven't lived there. I wasn't born in Palestine, but we haven't. But Dr. Ghada, if you can just sort of tell us how you maintained that and moved into the writing and so on, because I know you qualified as a medical doctor, so you had you were working, and then I think you became a doctor twice, from my understanding, once as a medic and once not. But so if you can tell us a little bit about how you related back to Palestine, how it impacted on your life, and then eventually we'll come to the point of where we go next, or what your aspirations might be.
Yeah. Look, unlike Salman, maybe, there was a long period in my life when I didn't think about Palestine, and I thought that I was somebody else. Growing up in England, in London, I wanted to be like my peers. I felt that the place we'd come from, this Palestine, was represented really by my parents, and particularly by my mother, who was very unhappy in England. And for me, therefore, that was sort of linked with a sadness. You know, the idea of Palestine was linked with sadness. Secondly, as I think I said, they didn't talk about life in Palestine, so I didn't have much of a picture of it, you know, growing up. And I know why. I mean, my father wanted us to have a, quote, normal life, not haunted by the terrible things that had happened to cause us to be in England. Anyhow, so, but the effect of it, I'm saying, is that I didn't feel particularly Palestinian, particularly Arab, and I joined my peers, and I wanted to feel I was English. And I, in fact, used to dislike my name, Ghada, because the people couldn't pronounce it, and they'd call me Ghada and Ghada, and, you know, they had a real problem. So I wished I was called Anne or something. Anyhow, all this was going along quite nicely until 1967. In other words, I was able to maintain this fiction that I was actually English and okay, you know, and summed up by a friend I had at university. One day she said to me, "Where's that Arab?" She used to say, where's that Arab? We shared a flat. I said, I was annoyed actually. I said, "Yes, well, I am Arab." She said, "Don't be silly. You're a dark-skinned English girl." I always remember that. Anyway, that's how it was till 1967. 67 shattered all of it. I remember it vividly. It's on the TV. I was by then a young doctor, and the sign, the thing on the TV was showing victorious Israeli troops, and everybody around me was clapping for the Israelis and saying, good for them, good for them, good for Israel. And I remember thinking, well, then I can't share in that, but then who am I then? What does that make of me? And so then began the long journey to rediscovering my Palestinian identity, and then becoming an activist in all sorts of ways for Palestine. And eventually, until eventually, I remember having a thought. I'd been an activist for years, and we, shared in pickets, demonstrations, letters, protests, all this stuff. And it was borne in on me that it hadn't brought back an inch of Palestine. I remember thinking, all that activism, all those demonstrations, it was just getting worse for the Palestinians. I thought to myself, there's something wrong in the approach. Well then, let me rethink this. And it was as a result of that, that it came to me that the most effective way I could engage people was through telling my own story. And it was that was behind In Search of Fatima, a personal story, but of course it symbolizes the feelings, the experiences of so many Palestinians. And so I wrote that, not by no means certain that it would really have an effect, but indeed it did. I swear to you that of all the things I've done in my life, my God, I did so much. That book did more than anything that I can think of to convey the story, the experience. I can only assure you that the number of people who wrote to me, who said, but this echoes what I feel. These were not Palestinians. These were Pakistanis, Muslims living in Britain, saying, my goodness, this really could be about us. Even, and I'm showing off, and I'm proud of saying this, Noam Chomsky wrote to me saying, I had at one point, I'd given him a copy of the book at some meeting, thinking to myself, he'd never read it. He did. He wrote and he said, it reminds me of my life as brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family that I did not identify with. And I left behind and I felt alien and I felt I didn't fit anywhere and so on. Really extraordinary email. So there we are. That was In Search of Fatima, and from then on, I went on writing.
Thank you for that. Dr. Salman, your sort of writing, if I can put it that way, was different. I mean, I know you have your memoirs, but also the beginning of your amazing project to document what happened and to the villages and so on. So how did you move into that from being, I think, a civil engineer like me and maybe like our famous leader Abu Ammar, who was a civil engineer in Kuwait as well?
Yes, indeed, yes. Just a small footnote, when I visited my birthplace for the first time, as you have seen in the video, what was tragic and surprising to my daughter, at the passport, it's, why are you here? Are you a tourist? He said, yes, we are tourists. And of course, I couldn't even see my birthplace had I not had a foreign passport. So I claimed to be a tourist in order to see my birthplace. It was a great tragedy. And who was talking to me? A Polish guy with a heavy English accent. He's questioning my 200-300 years history of my family in Palestine. So that was very tragic. But anyway, because we knew our country and because we became refugees, all my family have been involved in national movement. My eldest brother, two of them, and also my cousin, have been very active in forming the first PLO in 1964. And my eldest brother has been commander of the forces, Palestinian forces in Jordan in 1970. And he was killed there. And my eldest brother was a lawyer. He was, head of Palestinian syndicate of lawyers and so on. So we were very active in that. But I was in England and then Canada. And so I spent years probably, not all the time, of course, collecting documents about Palestine, every single department or house or library in England. Then I moved to Germany, I found Munich First World War archives. Then I went to Paris National Bibliothèque Nationale, and then the Istanbul archives, and went to New York. I went to United Nations, where I collected very important documents about Armistice Line and about battles in 1948, and the Library of Congress and all that. And over 30 or 40 years, I collected quite a number of documents, including one set of the aerial survey the British had taken of Palestine in 1945, 5,000 aerial photos. They took them just before they left, as I say, hurriedly, in a disgraceful escape from Palestine. So with this information, what are we going to do with it? We have to document it. And we documented it by using what's called GIS, Geographical Information System. And we have a huge database of all the refugees, where they come from, where they are now, what's their property, and who lives in their land. And I produced first the Atlas of Palestine, 1917 to 1966, which covers the area, the period from the mandate to a Nakba, and then after to 1966. That is 700-page atlas, which has 55,000 names. Then after that, I produced the Atlas of Palestine, 1871 to 1877, based on the British survey by Palestine Exploration Fund. Can we see the cover of that? Yes. This atlas is particularly important because it represents Palestine before the Zionist settlement in Palestine, the Arab Palestine. There is not a single Jewish colony in this atlas, out of 13,000 names and 500 pages. And of course, this long journey, a personal journey, I documented in a book in English called Mapping My Return, which has been discussed in some universities, including Westminster University about a few weeks ago. An Italian edition appeared on this, and I hope other editions appear. Now, what does lead us to? Not only documenting that. From that, as an engineer and planning engineer, I said, how can we effect the right of return? We know that the right of return is legal. There are hundreds of UN resolutions calling for the right of return. And it is also sacred for all Palestinians. So how can we plan it? Of course, the Europeans say, well, it's very difficult now, and the place is full of Jews, and what can you do? And this is, of course, a moral and racist question. If a burglar or a murderer goes into your house, kills your family, take your house, and he fills it with his friends, and you say, I want my house. And they tell you, you can't because he's already there. If that's the case, there will be no war against apartheid, no war against war crimes, no war against Europe would be still under Hitler today. All the wars of liberation are waged in order to correct the grave errors and mistakes and crimes. So that's not an excuse. But then said, let us do it from feasibility point of view. I made a study of every single village land in Palestine, whose people have become refugees, and found out who actually lives there now. And I found a very startling result that 87% of the Jews today in Israel live only in 12% of Israel's area. Actually, if you take only the built up area, it's only 2.5%. So who lives in the village land of the refugees? It's the kibbutz. And the kibbutz are 1 to 2% of Israeli population. These kibbutz are planted on the village land of Palestinians in order to prevent them from returning. In fact, if you take the Israel area as a whole and you look at land use according to the official Israeli estimate, more than 75% of Israeli area is under the control of Israeli army for its barracks, for training, for its factories, for even sometimes called military reserve. So Israel, or occupied Palestine, is really empty. Not all, I would say up to 85% of Palestinians can return tomorrow. In fact, I wrote about this in maps and lectures and so on. And only yesterday, I received a letter, I'm not going to say from whom, a very well-known American Zionist journalist. He's curious about the right of return. And he would say, what's going to happen to Jews? I said, look, this is the wrong question to ask. First, you have to ask me, what do you Jews do to atone for the crimes against Palestinians? You are trying to tell me, to ask me a question to find out what is good for the Jews. But you should answer the crime you have committed first. Tell me, what are you going to do to atone for the sins you committed against Palestinians? Even so, I explained to him that Jews can return, can stay in Palestine because it's still empty, provided one singular condition with no negotiations, that Zionism must be abolished and all war crimes have to be attained for, and that all property stolen, taken, to be returned, and restitution in the usual international law should be applied. That's the only formula for peace. And the result, the news you see of young people in Jerusalem today and in Gaza today, where people thought they are now finished and there is no Palestinians, should be an awakening for them that we can never give up our home. And we are 13 million people. In 2030 will be 18 million people. This is our country, our history. Before I keep saying Jerusalem is Palestinian longer than London is English. This is a fact of geography and history. So we are not going to give up. We are developing plans actually for how to implement that in real terms.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And of course, people may be wondering, maybe feeling a little uncomfortable about, the mention of what you explained now and the fact that, you were asked this question and you were saying people should atone for it. I mean, people watching what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah should see that as a microcosm of what happened in 1948. And if people are angry now that people in Sheikh Jarrah could be thrown out of their homes, then they should think, how are they thinking? What is their attitude to the people who are throwing them out of their homes? Because that's the direct relationship and impact on these people. And nobody should be saying to Salman or to Ghada, who experienced this, who were literally had to leave their homes, hoping to return, but having not managed it yet, that they can't tell them what to think of the people, the entity, and also the ideology that resulted in them being driven out of their homes. I'd like to move to Ghada and finish really with your thoughts about where what would be. I think the question that we discussed was sort of how do we unpick the injustice of 1948 as we come to the end of this discussion?
Yes, indeed. Clearly, we have to think of where we're going to go next with all this. And one of the problems that has always plagued this whole issue is the question of how. You know, not so much what, but how, because the ideas about how this should end and how it should be resolved, there are many ideas, they've been around for quite some time, but the question of how do you make it happen is the one that's really very important. Now, I'm known to be a supporter of the idea of one state, so that the Palestinians return to their homeland knowing that they will be living with the current residents who are Jewish Israelis. Now, the reason I say that is because I've sort of taken a shortcut, because clearly this conflict cannot end without the right of return. Quite obviously, the single most significant consequence of what happened in 1948 is the loss of the homeland, is the dispossession. And unless that is reversed, there can never be an end to this conflict. So the starting point is that we must all return. How are we going to do that? Well, my answer is there is only one way. You have to recognize the reality. There are people there now. And unless we do a Zionism on them, which we're not going to do, and throw them out in the way they did it to us, we accept that they are there, and therefore we will have to live together, all of us. And the only way to do it is in a unitary state. And I wrote a book about that, Married to Another Man, which I do hope can be shown on screen. I hope it can be shown.
I think
anyway.
James is doing his best to bring it up. Yeah, here we go.
That's right. Married to Another Man. I know, very interesting title. It refers to something. There's a good reason for it. In which I've written to explain how it is that the single unitary state in Palestine is the only answer to this problem. Now, so then the question then, as I said, which is really very important, is if everybody agrees with me and obviously with Salman that the return of the people who were expelled and their descendants is the way to end this, then the next question would have to be how. And I've mapped out that the way it has to happen is by creating this unitary state. But then the next question is, well, okay, that's fine. If we all agree to this, the next question is, how do you do that? Now, I cannot, because there's no time now, but all I can do in conclusion is to point the way to what I believe is the only practical method in which this can happen. And that is by, and I'm summarizing it very quickly, is that Israel, Palestine today is one state. We all know that, it is one state. Everybody in the territory between the river and the sea is ruled by one sovereign power, and that is Israel. But you know, and I know, that it is ruled inequitably. It is an apartheid system that rules there. It seems to me that the obvious route is to work on reversing the apartheid so that we arrive at a situation of equality of rights within that territory. That is what we have to aim for. And that is what I will want to work on for the rest of my activist time. And I hope everybody will join me in that.
Thank you very much indeed, Ghada. I don't know, Dr. Salman, if you share the question as I do. Of course, the most important thing is for people to return, for the Palestinians to realize their rights. I always say, whether it's one state, two states, 10, 20, I really don't care. but these people have got to have their rights to return to their homes and then to work out a political entity that would allow people to live in peace. So that's the way that I look at it. And of course, as you know, in terms of the PSCs, what drives us is the issue of the Palestinian right to self-determination. And that is, you know, we won't sit here in London as PSC, although as Palestinians we have our own views, and tell the Palestinians that you should go for one state or two states. But what we can do is to continue to raise our voice and to tell people about what happened in 1948. Because the sort of the pro-Israelis always try to turn it into, let's forget about the Nakba. The word Nakba is something that shouldn't be talked about, but that is what this week is about. Talking about the Nakba, reminding people of what happened. What you shared with us has been so upsetting in so many ways. But I hope people listening will begin to think, how would I feel if that happened to me? How would I feel if that happened to me? And we've been talking about Jews all the way through this webinar, because as I wrote in a letter to The Guardian a few years ago, we didn't choose who came to occupy us. So who can we talk about except it was Jews, but guided by Zionism, who came to Palestine and threw Palestinians out. And that is what we need to continue to remind people about. However painful it is for some people, they might find it uncomfortable, but that is exactly what happened. If it's okay with you both, I would like to draw this to a conclusion. Unless Dr. Salman, you want to finish with a couple of words?
Yes. There is one thing I haven't said yet. Well, I share your thoughts that we have to look at the problem itself and solve it from its roots. And also, I'm not like you interested in a state or two states or three states. Let me just go back a little bit. I made an atlas called The Return Journey,
yes,
which shows the villages which have been depopulated and the main features remaining of them. And on top of that, we have a new road system in Israel and the kibbutz, which are built on their land. This represents Palestine before and also what Israel is doing with our land today. Now, there is a basic fact we cannot escape from. You cannot treat cancer with aspirin. You have to solve the problem basically. Apartheid, racism, war crimes, you cannot live with them. Nobody ever lived with these in history. All history studies shows you that these evil regimes, you cannot live with them. They have to be removed. I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about regimes. Nazism has finished in Germany. There are still Germans. The French in Algeria, they are French in their country. The Dutch in South Africa, they are now citizens. We are talking about ideology which brought death and destruction. You cannot live with that, full stop. There is no example in history that you can live with that except by force for an unlimited period of time. This is the point now. Secondly, you cannot keep a pyramid on its apex with the base on top, except by strong hands. This is a unnatural situation. You cannot defy geography. You cannot defy history. You cannot eliminate people for long, except by brute force. This brute force will come to an end sometime. So justice is the only principle which is lasting. And that means I call for every human being who wants to live in Palestine to adhere to human rights law, to live in a democratic country, not to have any ideology of racism or apartheid or this. When these people return to their homes, Palestinians, and recover their property, as has been the case in everywhere, in Germany, in Bosnia, in many countries in the world, people are found in a piece of land called Palestine. These people decide in a democratic way what kind of government they want, with nobody is master over anybody else. And that is the only solution which will be lasting. Look, the Portuguese created Goa in India for 200 years. In the continent of India, you cannot create Portuguese colony in India. It's gone. The Chinese created in Mackay a colony for the British in China for hundreds of years. You cannot keep that. It's gone. The Portuguese and the Americans create a colony in Philippines, and they have to leave. All colonies, especially like Palestine, if they live in an environment which is alien to them, Palestine is part of the Arab world. You cannot keep that except by brute force. And brute force has a short shelf life. One day it will crumble. We know history is full of examples of that. So what I'm saying is the only lasting solution is, number one, human beings are equal and they have equal rights. Anyone whose property is stolen, returned to him. All war crimes have been attained for. And then you say, I want to live in this country. Then you can live as a citizen without luggage. I keep telling Jews in my lectures, why don't Jews live in Palestine like Jews live in London? They don't kill the British people and take their homes. They don't butcher them. They don't defame them. They don't call them terrorists. They live with them under the rules of the country. If they want to do that, then they are normal human beings and they can live like everybody else. Everything else is just water in the drain, and it will only lengthen the misery. So that is the future. There is no other future. I say that there is no other future.
And of course, we know that there are many who live in Israel who absolutely understand the rights of the Palestinians and support them in trying to regain their rights. And that's an important thing for us to end on. And indeed, as there are so many Jewish supporters of the Palestinian people who are also members of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and people that we work with, it is very much about this ideology that didn't stop at the point of saying right of determination for Jews. It said in Palestine. It was when it brought our homeland as a collective Palestinian people into the equation that it became a problem for us, and one that both of you had to sort of suffer the consequences of. But we still want to look forward to a peaceful world and a peaceful historic Palestine that will treat everyone with dignity and with humanity. And at the moment, looking at the images coming out of Jerusalem, that is not happening, and that must stop. For everyone's sake. I'd like to finish this by thanking you both very much indeed for your remarks, for your thoughts, for your memories, and remind people, please come out tomorrow evening to the protest at 6 o'clock. And then on Saturday, there's a whole day of action. As you know, Saturday is the commemoration of the Nakba. We in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign will not stop supporting the Palestinian people until they gain their rights. What they ask for is freedom, justice, and equality. And when they attain that, Palestine will be free. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Thank you, PSC, for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.